My name is Elena Marrow. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind but land hollow: easygoing, low maintenance, the one who doesn't need much. People tend to assume I'm adaptable because I'm quiet, forgiving because I pause before I speak, and uncomplicated because I don't ask for the spotlight. I've learned that when you don't demand attention, others often mistake that for not having depth. I work in a practical field: numbers, planning, systems, the kind of work that runs in the background while louder personalities take credit for outcomes. I've always been fine with that. I believed, maybe naively, that consistency would be recognized eventually. That if you showed up, stayed honest, and didn't dramatize your pain, things would balance out on their own. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or proving that I was secretly brilliant all along. It's about a moment when something deeply personal was reframed as transactional, and how that reframing quietly changed the way I saw my past, my family, and myself. At a family dinner that was supposed to be ordinary, no raised voices, no slammed doors, my parents handed me a spreadsheet, not metaphorically, literally. A document itemizing the cost of raising me: tuition, medical bills, food, housing, interest-adjusted totals. At the bottom, $120,000. What followed wasn't shouting or tears. It was worse than that. It was calm, polite, almost managerial. Love presented as a balance sheet. Affection translated into liabilities and returns. A suggestion, never stated outright, that gratitude should look like repayment. This story is about the slow realization that the role you've been playing in a system may never change unless you change how you participate in it. It's about what happens when silence stops being a default and becomes a decision. About the difference between being invisible and being observant. About how power doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, and without asking you to take sides. There are no villains twirling mustaches here. Just people, patterns, and a reckoning that didn't happen all at once, but in stages. Quiet ones. If you've ever felt valued only when you were useful, or loved only when you were easy, you might recognize parts of yourself in what comes next. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered whether the people who say they love you would still feel the same if you stopped being convenient? To my parents, I was the easy child, not the gifted one who needed special handling, not the rebellious one who caused scenes or demanded explanations. I was the one who adapted, the one who figured things out without asking too many questions, the one who didn't cry long enough to make anyone uncomfortable. If there was a form to be filled out, I filled it out. If there was a problem to smooth over, I smoothed it. I learned early that being helpful earned approval faster than being honest about confusion or fear. And so, I became helpful by default. At family gatherings, my role was invisible but essential. I cleared plates before anyone asked. I remembered birthdays without reminders. I translated emotional tension into logistics: who should sit where, what topic to avoid, when to redirect a conversation before it soured. People often confuse that kind of awareness with passivity. It isn't. It's labor. Quiet labor. My parents like to tell stories about me that always sounded the same. She was so independent. She never gave us trouble. She understood sacrifice. Those words were meant as compliments. I accepted them as such, even when I didn't fully understand what they cost me. Independence became an expectation, not a choice. Understanding sacrifice became a requirement, not a value. When money was tight, I learned not to ask. When emotions ran high, I learned to wait. When praise was given, it was often comparative. How I was easier than other children, how grateful they were that at least one of us didn't add stress. I internalized that. Being low impact felt like love. At school, teachers described me as reliable. At work later on, managers said the same thing. Reliable is a word that sounds solid, but it also means replaceable. You don't worry about what won't surprise you. You don't look closely at what never complains. At home, reliability translated into an assumption. If something needed doing, I would do it. If something needed absorbing, I would absorb it. My parents didn't sit me down and assign me this role. It was more subtle than that. Roles like this are never announced. They're reinforced through small rewards, approval, calm, the absence of conflict. I don't think they meant harm. That's important to say. They believed they were raising a responsible adult. They believed love was demonstrated through provision, through numbers that added up on paper. Emotional fluency wasn't their language. Structure was. And I learned to speak it fluently. But being fluent in structure doesn't mean you stop needing softness. It just means you stop asking for it. When I moved out, nothing about our dynamic changed. I was still the one who checked in, who made sure holidays were coordinated, who handled practical details. I didn't ask for help often, and when I did, I made sure it sounded reasonable, quantifiable, temporary. Need, if it appeared at all, had to be justified. I think that's why no one noticed how tired I was becoming. When you're good at managing yourself, people assume you don't need to be managed with care. They forget that self-sufficiency can be learned, not innate. Looking back, I realize something uncomfortable. My parents didn't really know me. They knew my outputs, my compliance, my capacity, but not my interior life, not my doubts, not the quiet recalculations happening behind my eyes every time I chose peace over truth. And I didn't correct that misunderstanding, not because I was afraid, but because correcting it felt unnecessary. I believed my value was already understood. I believed wrong. At that point in my life, I still thought being seen wasn't as important as being useful. I still thought love and responsibility were the same thing, just expressed differently. I didn't yet understand how dangerous it is to let others define your worth solely by what you cost or what you contribute. That realization came later, much later. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. We were sitting in my parents' kitchen, the kind of afternoon that doesn't feel significant while you're inside it. Coffee is cooling on the counter. The radio is low in the background. I had stopped by after work to drop something off, documents my father needed help organizing. I remember thinking how ordinary it all felt. Familiar, safe. My mother was talking about expenses. Not complaining exactly, just listing them the way she always did, like inventory. Utilities, insurance, repairs. Money was her preferred language of stress. If she could name the numbers, she could manage the feeling. At one point, she laughed lightly and said, "You know, raising kids is the most expensive thing you'll ever do." It was said generally, to the room. I nodded, the way you do when a statement isn't really meant for discussion. Then she looked at me and added, "Well, you especially. College wasn't cheap." She smiled when she said it, not sharp, not angry, almost teasing. Something in my chest tightened just slightly. Not pain, more like pressure. A sensation I'd learned to ignore. I responded the way I always did. I smiled back. "I know, I'm grateful." That should have been the end of it. It was a single sentence, casually delivered, followed by a change of subject. No one else reacted. My father continued reading something on his phone. The radio hummed on, but I noticed what had shifted. The comment wasn't about shared memory or mutual effort. It was an accounting note, a reminder of cost, of investment. And it had been directed at me specifically, not the abstract idea of parenthood. I told myself I was being sensitive. Parents talk about money, parents talk about sacrifice. This was normal. This was harmless. Still, the moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the next few weeks, similar comments surfaced, always lightly, always framed as humor or fact. "Student loans are no joke. You were lucky we helped." "We put a lot into your education." Not every child appreciates what they're given. None of these statements was false. That's what made them difficult to challenge. They floated in the space between gratitude and obligation, never quite landing on either. I noticed that the comments only appeared in certain contexts. When I mentioned work stress, when I talked about moving apartments, when I hesitated before agreeing to a family plan. It was as if my independence triggered a need to remind me of its origins. Again, I stayed quiet. Silence had always worked for me. Silence preserved harmony. Silence avoided escalation. And there was no clear accusation to respond to anyway. You can't argue with facts presented politely. What unsettled me wasn't what they were saying. It was what they were not saying. There was no curiosity about how I was doing, no interest in whether I felt supported. Just a subtle recalibration of our relationship from parent and child to investor and return. I didn't confront them because there was nothing to confront. Not yet. A single comment is nothing. A pattern requires time. So I watched. I paid attention to when the comments appeared, and when they didn't. I noticed how quickly the conversation moved on afterward, as if nothing had been introduced at all. I noticed how easily I accepted the emotional weight without acknowledgement. And I noticed something else too. No one ever reminded my siblings of their cost, only me. At the time, I told myself it was because I was the responsible one, the one who would understand, the one who wouldn't take offense. That was true, but it was also the beginning of something else. A small cut doesn't bleed much, it doesn't demand care, but it teaches the body where it's vulnerable. And once you know where someone is least likely to protest, that's where pressure goes. I didn't change my behavior then. I didn't pull away. I didn't grow colder or sharper. I simply started remembering. Once you notice something, it becomes difficult to unnotice it. The comments didn't escalate. They multiplied, quietly, predictably, always delivered with the same calm tone, the same casual framing. Never angry, never cruel enough to object to, just persistent enough to redefine the air between us. It became normal for money to enter conversations that had nothing to do with it. If I talked about a new opportunity at work, my father would nod and say, "Well, we did invest a lot in your education. Good to see it paying off." If I mentioned traveling, my mother would smile and add, "Just remember how much it costs to raise a child before you have one." There was always a pivot, a way to circle back to cost, to sacrifice, to contribute, and every time I absorbed it, I told myself this was generational. They grew up measuring stability in numbers. They didn't know how to speak about emotion without translating it into logistics. If this was their way of expressing concern or pride, who was I to correct it? That rationalization was comforting. It allowed me to stay where I was, inside the role that had always worked. So I stayed quiet. I didn't correct them when they implied that my achievements were extensions of their planning, rather than my effort. I didn't point out that I'd been financially independent for years. I didn't mention that I'd paid off my own debts, managed my own risks, built my own safety nets. I didn't need credit, or so I told myself. But silence has a side effect. It trains people on what they can say without consequence. Slowly, the comments became less abstract, more directed. "After everything we've done for you, we never expected anything back, of course, but you're in a good position because of us." There was always a pause after those statements, a space where something unsaid hovered, an expectation that I would fill it with reassurance, with gratitude, with compliance. And I did. I thanked them. I acknowledged their effort. I reassured them that I remembered, that I appreciated, that I wasn't ungrateful. What I didn't say was that gratitude loses its meaning when it's demanded, that appreciation becomes an obligation when it's used as leverage. At the time, I still believed this was a misunderstanding I could manage by being clearer, kinder, and more accommodating. I believed that if I just showed enough respect, the subtext would dissolve. It didn't. It hardened. What changed wasn't their language. It was my awareness. I started hearing the same phrases echo in different contexts, at family dinners, on phone calls, even in messages that were supposed to be about something else. I began to notice how quickly they referenced the past whenever the present didn't align with their expectations. How was the contribution remembered only in one direction? Love was described as something they gave, not something we shared. And still, I didn't push back, because pushing back would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to name yet. That what I was experiencing wasn't care, it was control, disguised as accounting. Control doesn't always come with rules. Sometimes it comes with reminders. Reminders of what you owe, of what you cost, of the effort someone else expended so you could exist comfortably now. And because those reminders were technically true, they were difficult to refuse. Facts don't feel like manipulation when you agree with them. I normalized it. I learned to preempt the comments by volunteering gratitude before it was requested. I learned to minimize my needs so they wouldn't feel unbalanced. I learned to frame my decisions in ways that aligned with their narrative of return on investment. All of this happened quietly, without resentment, without anger, or so I thought. In reality, something inside me was recalibrating. I was beginning to see the pattern not as isolated remarks, but as a system where my role was to justify the past by behaving predictably in the present. That realization didn't make me louder. It made me more careful. I started choosing my words more precisely. I stopped offering unnecessary information. I observed instead of explaining. If silence had once been instinctive, it was now intentional. And that was new. I didn't yet know what I would do with this awareness. I only knew that the dynamic we had was no longer invisible to me. And once a dynamic becomes visible, it can no longer operate unquestioned. I was still the reliable one, still calm, still compliant on the surface. But inside, I had stopped assuming this was normal. I had started to wonder what would happen if I no longer played along. Roles in families don't come with titles. No one hands you a card that says this is who you are now. They emerge through repetition, through what's rewarded and what's ignored, through which behaviors keep the peace and which ones disrupt it. Mine was clear by the time I allowed myself to see it. I wasn't the child who needed protecting. I wasn't the one whose feelings required careful handling. I was the stabilizer, the one who made the system work by absorbing its weight. Reliable, useful, invisible. When my parents talked about me to others, it was always in functional terms. I was doing well I was settled, I was fine. These were not lies, but they were incomplete truths. They reduced my interior life to a status update. And because I never corrected that reduction, it stuck. I realized how fixed my role was during a conversation that had nothing to do with conflict. My mother was discussing a disagreement she'd had with a relative. How draining it was. How emotionally complicated. Then she paused and said, almost with relief, "At least with you, I don't have to worry. You're so understanding." Understanding, again. It landed like confirmation. Understanding meant I wouldn't push back. It meant I wouldn't ask for emotional labor in return. It meant I would carry my own weight quietly so theirs felt lighter. I had been assigned the role of emotional shock absorber. Once I named it, I could see how consistently it shaped our interactions. If I expressed fatigue, it was reframed as a phase. If I expressed frustration, it was softened into perspective. If I expressed boundaries, they were treated as negotiable. And if I didn't express anything at all, that was ideal. The role depended on my silence, not because my parents were malicious, but because the system we'd built only worked if one person didn't need much. So they made sure I didn't. Looking back, I can see how my parents' values fed into this. They believed in responsibility, in return for effort, in the idea that good planning produces good outcomes. Emotion to them was secondary, something you managed after the important things were handled. And I fit perfectly into that worldview. I was the proof that their system worked, that investment yielded stability, that sacrifice produced gratitude, which meant questioning the role wasn't just personal. It threatened the narrative they relied on to feel justified. I didn't consciously realize this at the time. I just felt a growing sense of compression, like I was being flattened into something simpler than I was. I wasn't angry. That came later. At this stage, I was still trying to optimize, to adjust myself so the system would feel fair again. I asked fewer questions. I shared less. I stayed agreeable. But something had shifted internally. Instead of assuming that harmony meant health, I began to ask whether harmony was simply the absence of resistance, whether my reliability had become a resource that others depended on without acknowledging it. The most unsettling part was recognizing my own participation in this. I had helped build the role by rewarding certain responses with calm and withholding others to avoid friction. I had learned which parts of myself were welcome and which were inconvenient, and I had complied. That realization didn't make me confront anyone. It made me pause. It made me stop filling every silence, stop smoothing every edge. I started letting small moments remain unresolved, not to provoke, but to observe. And what I observed confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. When I didn't immediately reassure, tension appeared. When I didn't volunteer gratitude, discomfort followed. When I didn't agree right away, explanations were offered, long ones, persuasive ones, designed to guide me back into alignment. They weren't angry with me. They were confused. Confused by the absence of the response they were accustomed to receiving. That confusion told me everything I needed to know about the role I'd been assigned. It wasn't based on who I was, it was based on how well I functioned within their expectations. For the first time, I considered a quiet, unsettling question. What would happen if I stopped performing this role altogether? The day something shifted didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where anyone stormed out of the room. If you had walked past our table that evening, you would have seen 3 adults eating dinner, speaking calmly, passing dishes back and forth. What changed happened entirely inside me. It was a family dinner planned weeks in advance. Nothing special, just a routine gathering. I arrived on time, brought what I said I would, and settled into my usual seat. The conversation moved along predictable lines: work, logistics, a neighbor's renovation. Comfortable. Controlled. Halfway through the meal, my father stood up and said he had something to show me. He returned with a folder. Again, nothing about this felt alarming at first. My parents loved documents. Folders meant order. Preparation, saudi. I assumed it was something practical. Estate planning maybe, or a question about insurance. He slid the folder across the table toward me. Inside was a printed spreadsheet. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. Rows, columns, dates spanning years. Categories that felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Education, healthcare, housing, food, miscellaneous. At the bottom, a total. 12,000美元. My mother spoke first. Calm, measured. We thought it might be good for you to see this. I didn't react immediately. Not because I was stunned, though I was, but because my mind was moving too quickly. I was trying to understand the intention before the emotion. My father explained the methodology, how they'd estimated certain costs, how they'd adjusted for inflation, how conservative the numbers were really. It was presented like a report, neutral, almost proud. No one said the word debt, no one said the word owe, but the implication sat there, heavy and undeniable. Love, translated into line items. As they talked, I felt something unusual. Distance. Not dissociation. Clarity. The same clarity you get when you step back from something and see its shape for the first time. I realized they weren't angry with me. They weren't accusing me of anything. They were trying to make something visible that had always existed in their minds. A ledger. This wasn't about guilt, it was about framing. They wanted me to understand the weight of their contribution, to contextualize my independence as an outcome of their investment, to ensure that my future decisions remained tethered to that understanding. And suddenly, I saw the entire pattern all at once. The comments, the reminders, the timing, the way money entered emotional conversations, the way gratitude was expected, not invited. This spreadsheet wasn't an escalation, it was a conclusion. I listened, I nodded, I asked clarifying questions, not because I needed answers, but because I wanted to understand how far this thinking went. Inside, something settled. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way I would have been years earlier. Instead, I felt a quiet finality. Because once love is itemized, it stops being relational. It becomes transactional. And transactions follow different rules. They finished explaining. The room fell into a brief silence. My mother smiled gently. We just want you to have perspective. I looked at the spreadsheet again, at the neat columns, the careful math. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. They didn't see this as inappropriate. They saw it as responsible. That realization didn't break me. It released me. I thanked them. I meant it. Not for the document, but for the clarity it provided. I folded the spreadsheet carefully and placed it back in the folder. We finished dinner. We talked about something else. I drove home in silence. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was upset, but because my mind was reorganizing itself. I stopped asking whether they were being fair. I started asking what kind of relationship this framework allowed. And more importantly, what kind of participation was required from me. That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. Irreversibly. After that dinner, I didn't confront my parents. Not because I was afraid to, but because I no longer saw confrontation as useful. Something had clarified so completely that words felt unnecessary. The spreadsheet had done what arguments never could. It had revealed the operating system. And once you understand the system, you stop reacting to individual outputs. So I stayed quiet. But the silence was different from before. Previously, my quiet had been automatic. A reflex shaped by years of smoothing, accommodating, and protecting the emotional weather of the room. This time, silence was deliberate, observant, strategic. I began to notice how often I had filled gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped doing that. When my parents referenced the spreadsheet indirectly, comments about how much things add up over time or what we've put into you, I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't argue either. I let the comment exist without a response. The effect was subtle, but immediate. They lingered on those statements longer than usual, as if waiting for something. For me to acknowledge, to affirm, to soften. I didn't. Not coldly, not pointedly, just neutrally. And in that neutrality, something interesting happened. They grew slightly uneasy. It wasn't discomfort exactly, more like disorientation. The emotional rhythm they were used to had changed, and they didn't know why. Silence, when expected to perform, becomes noticeable. I also stopped volunteering information. I didn't update them on my finances, my plans, my long-term thinking. Not because I was hiding, but because I no longer felt obligated to provide raw material for interpretation. I shared less, but what I did share was factual and complete. No qualifiers, no emotional framing. They began asking more questions. Is everything okay? You seem busy. You're very reserved lately. I answered honestly, without elaboration. I'm fine. Work has been full. I've been thinking. All true, none exploitable. What they mistook for withdrawal was actually containment. At the same time, I began reviewing my own records, quietly, methodically. Not out of anger, but curiosity. If our relationship could be translated into numbers on their side, I wanted to understand the full equation. I looked at what I'd contributed over the years. Financially, practically, emotionally. The holidays I'd funded without mention. The logistical support I'd provided, the time, the labor. I didn't do this to tally up a counterclaim. I did it to ground myself in reality, because something else had shifted too. I stopped feeling small. Once love is framed as a transaction, emotion loses its leverage. You stop asking to be seen. You start evaluating terms. And I realized I had been overpaying in ways no one had accounted for. This wasn't a moment of empowerment in the dramatic sense. There was no surge of confidence or sense of triumph. It was calmer than that. I felt steady. I also noticed how quickly my parents interpreted my silence as weakness. They assumed I was processing, or feeling guilty, or unsure of myself. That assumption worked in my favor. When you're underestimated, you're given room. When people believe you're passive, they don't monitor your movement closely. So I moved carefully. I updated my documents. I organized my finances. I reviewed agreements and obligations that had never been formally named but always implicitly existed. I didn't announce any of this. There was no reason to. The silence created space. Space to think without interference. Space to act without explanation. And perhaps most importantly, space to detach emotionally without appearing distant. I was still polite, still present, still calm, but I had stopped offering access. Silence, I learned, doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means control. What they never noticed was how much I was already trained for this moment. They assumed my quiet meant softness, that my lack of reaction meant I didn't know what to do next. But my entire adult life had been preparation of a different kind, just not the kind they were watching for. I work with systems. I notice patterns. I document behavior not emotionally, but structurally. Over the years, I had learned to keep records because it made life easier, because clarity prevents misunderstanding, because having information reduces anxiety. They thought I was organized. They didn't realize I was observant. While they spoke in generalities, after everything we've done, how much it all adds up. I had dates, context, sequences. I remembered exactly when support had been offered and when it hadn't, when help was conditional, when it came with commentary, when it quietly stopped. I also noticed something else, something they never considered. The spreadsheet they handed me only measured one side of the exchange. It counted what they had spent. It didn't count what I had carried. Not the years of emotional regulation, not the role of mediator, not the moments I made myself smaller to keep things stable, not the opportunities I delayed because independence had been framed as ingratitude. Those things don't show up in Excel, but they accumulate. So I began preparing, not to confront, but to reposition. I reviewed every informal expectation that had followed me into adulthood, the assumptions about holidays, about availability, about financial contribution, about emotional access. I asked myself a single question over and over: what is actually required of me? And what have I simply been providing out of habit? The answers were sobering. I realized how often I had acted without being asked, how often I had solved problems that weren't mine, how many invisible responsibilities had taken on because no one else noticed them, or because noticing them would have required effort. Preparation for me didn't look dramatic. It looked like spreadsheets of my own, clean ones, objective ones, not about blame, but about boundaries. I listed what I was willing to continue, what I wasn't, what was reciprocal, what wasn't. I also consulted quietly, not for validation, but for perspective. A financial advisor, a legal professional, neutral third parties who could tell me whether my understanding of responsibility was distorted by emotion. It wasn't. If anything, I had been overly generous. What they also didn't notice was how my demeanor protected me. I didn't change my tone. I didn't broadcast dissatisfaction. I didn't withdraw suddenly or dramatically, so there was nothing to respond to. People rarely intervene when there's no visible problem. That allowed me to prepare without interference. I adjusted my commitments, slowly. I stopped defaulting to yes. I delayed responses. I asked for time instead of offering solutions. Each change was small enough to be unremarkable on its own, but together, they formed a shift. My parents didn't comment on it at first. They simply adapted, expecting me to step in eventually, the way I always had. I didn't, and still I said nothing. I also re-examined the emotional language I used. I removed apologies where they weren't needed. I replaced reassurance with neutrality. I stopped framing my choices as reactions to their needs. The less emotional information I provided, the less leverage existed. What surprised me most was how natural this felt. Not empowering in a triumphant sense, but aligned. Like I had finally stopped swimming against a current I'd never chosen. There was no resentment fueling this preparation, no desire to win, just a growing commitment to accuracy. If our relationship was going to be defined by accounting, then it deserved complete accounting, not just numbers that justified one narrative. They never noticed the preparation because they never believed I was capable of it. To them, I was still the understanding one, the flexible one, the one who would eventually circle back into alignment. They didn't see the shift because they weren't looking for it. And by the time they realized something had changed, the groundwork was already laid. Quietly, carefully, without drama. Exactly the way I had learned to do everything else. The reveal wasn't something I announced. There was no moment where I sat back, exhaled, and said, "Now I understand everything." It came the way real understanding usually does. Slowly, then all at once, in a quiet moment when nothing external was happening. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, late at night, the room lit by a single lamp. In front of me were two documents. One was the spreadsheet my parents had given me. The other was my own. Something I had built over weeks, not to mirror theirs, but to contextualize it. That was when it became clear. The spreadsheet they gave me wasn't about money. It was about authority. By translating love into cost, they weren't asking for repayment in dollars. They were asserting a position, a hierarchy where their past sacrifices granted them ongoing influence over my present and future choices. Once I saw that, everything aligned. Why did the reminders surface when I asserted independence? Gratitude was expected, not optional. Why are emotional conversations so often detoured into finances? The ledger wasn't a record, it was a claim. And here was the private reveal. Claims only work if they're acknowledged. I realized, with surprising calm, that I had already been honoring a contract I never agreed to. A contract that existed entirely in implication. One that required my emotional availability, my compliance, my predictability. And because I had never challenged its existence, it had quietly governed our relationship. That realization didn't provoke anger. It provoked relief. Because contracts can be renegotiated or dissolved, I reviewed my own document again. Not just numbers, but patterns. Instances where support was given conditionally. Moments where help was withheld without discussion. Times when I had been expected to absorb responsibility without recognition. There was no villain emerging from these pages, just a clear imbalance. And then I noticed something even more important. They had no formal leverage, no legal obligation, no financial dependency, no binding agreement of any kind. Only expectation, expectation reinforced by habit, expectation enforced by my silence. Once I saw that, the weight I'd been carrying for years became optional. This was the moment I stopped feeling defensive. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to explain myself or justify my choices. The internal shift was enough. I closed both documents and sat there for a long time, not thinking, just feeling the absence of pressure. It felt unfamiliar, spacious. The reveal wasn't that they were wrong. It was that I was free. Free to choose how much access they had to my decisions. Free to redefine what gratitude looked like. Free to participate in the relationship without surrendering authorship of my life. I understood then why silence had been so effective. Why had it created clarity? By not reacting emotionally, I had allowed the structure to show itself. And structures, once visible, lose their mystique. I also understood why they would never have expected this response from me. They believed power lived in numbers, not in awareness. They believed authority came from having invested, not from having consent. They had mistaken my composure for compliance. This realization didn't change my behavior overnight. That wasn't the point. What changed was the direction. I no longer moved toward alignment automatically. I moved toward choice. Every decision after that was filtered through a new question. Is this something I am choosing, or something I've been trained to provide? That question became my anchor. It didn't make me colder. It made me precise. And precision, I learned, is the most understated form of strength. By the time I stood up from that table, nothing externally had shifted. But internally, the hierarchy was gone. There was no debt, only autonomy. And from that moment on, every step I took, every silence, every delay, every decision was intentional. They still didn't notice. Not yet. Clarity forces a choice. Once you see a system for what it is, you can't unknow it. You either continue participating as before, or you change the terms. There's no neutral ground once awareness settles in. For weeks after my private realization, I lived inside that decision point. I didn't rush it. I didn't act impulsively. I let the options sit side by side and examine them without judgment. Option 1 was familiar. Continue as I had. Offer selective compliance. Manage expectations gently. Absorb the cost of emotional imbalance in exchange for surface harmony. This option required no confrontation, no disruption, no risk of misunderstanding. But it required one thing I was no longer willing to give: authorship. Option 2 was louder. Confront the spreadsheet directly. Challenge the framing. Explain why it was harmful. Demand acknowledgement of emotional labor. This option offered emotional resolution, but also escalation. It assumed they were capable of hearing something they didn't believe was wrong. It required me to invest energy into persuading people who saw their actions as responsible, even generous. I knew how that story ended. Option 3 was quieter. Withdraw, not emotionally, but structurally. Remove myself from the implied contract without announcing its termination. Stop participating in exchanges that rely on unspoken obligation. This option didn't promise immediate understanding. It didn't offer validation. It didn't even guarantee peace. But it preserved my integrity. I sat with that option the longest, because choosing it meant accepting something difficult. They might never understand my reasoning. They might interpret my changes as distance, ingratitude, or rejection, and I would have to let them. This was the irreversible part. Once you stop performing a role, you can't control how others reinterpret your absence. I weighed that carefully. I asked myself whether I needed them to understand in order to proceed, whether my sense of self depended on their agreement. The answer surprised me. It didn't. I realized I had spent years preemptively managing their comfort, making myself legible to their worldview, translating my needs into acceptable terms. But I was tired of translation. The decision, when it came, was quiet. I chose option 3, not as a punishment, not as a withdrawal of love, but as a recalibration of participation. I decided I would no longer engage in any dynamic that treated my existence as a line item to be justified. That meant saying no without explanation. It meant letting discomfort exist without soothing it. It meant allowing silence to remain unanswered. It also meant accepting that some connections only function when one person is over-functioning. The moment I accepted that, the fear dissipated. Because fear thrives on ambiguity, on the hope that things might change if you just try harder, on the belief that your effort will eventually be recognized. Once I released that hope, what remained was choice. I didn't tell my parents what I had decided. There was no announcement, no ultimatum, no dramatic turning point. The decision didn't need witnesses. What mattered was that I stopped negotiating with myself. From that point on, my actions followed a consistent logic. Not reactive, not defensive, simply aligned. I would not justify my independence as a return on investment. I would not perform gratitude to secure approval. I would not accept accounting as a substitute for care. This wasn't a rebellion, it was an exit. And once you leave a system internally, the external exit becomes a matter of time. They would feel the shift eventually. Not because I explained it, but because the system would no longer receive the input it depended on. That was the path I chose. Irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Once the decision was made, the movement that followed was almost invisible. That was intentional. I didn't announce changes. I didn't reframe conversations. I didn't warn anyone that the dynamic had shifted. I simply began operating according to the decision I'd already settled internally. And when decisions are settled, they don't need defending. The first changes were logistical. I adjusted my availability, not dramatically, just enough to remove the assumption that I was always accessible. Calls were returned later. Messages didn't receive immediate replies. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute needs that weren't emergencies. Nothing I did was unreasonable. That was the point. I also separated systems that had been quietly intertwined for years. Shared responsibilities that had never been formally defined were clarified, sometimes through action rather than discussion. I handled what was mine. I stopped handling what wasn't. Financially, I became exact. Not stingy, not distant, just precise. I paid what I owed. I didn't cover what I wasn't responsible for. I declined vague requests that relied on emotional momentum rather than clear need. When asked why, I didn't explain. I can't commit to that. That doesn't work for me. I'll need to pass. Series. Short sentences. No justification. What surprised me was how uncomfortable this made them. Not because of the refusals themselves, but because of the absence of narrative around them. They were used to context, to explain, to emotional framing that reassured them I was still aligned. Now there was only one fact, and facts without cushioning feel like boundaries. I also took care of things quietly in the background. Documents updated, contingencies planned, decisions finalized without consultation. Not out of secrecy, but out of sovereignty. I had spent years inviting input where none was required. Now I stopped doing that. At no point did I act against them. I simply stopped acting for them. That distinction mattered. The most noticeable shift was internal. I no longer anticipated their reactions when making choices. I no longer asked myself how a decision would land, or whether it would be interpreted correctly. I asked one question only: is this aligned with the life I'm responsible for? If the answer was yes, I proceeded. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means you're no longer negotiating every step with an audience. Predictably, they didn't notice at first. People rarely do when the change involves the removal of something they've taken for granted. They assume it will reappear, that it's temporary, the system will self-correct. They waited for me to step in. I didn't. And still I remained calm, present, polite. No visible conflict meant no visible problem, which gave me time. Time to solidify changes. Time to establish new rhythms. Time to become consistent in a way that didn't rely on explanation. Consistency is what makes boundaries real, not declarations. By the time they began to sense something was different, the new structure was already in place. Requests met with pauses, assumptions unmet, emotional cues unanswered. They started asking indirect questions. You've been busy lately. Everything okay? You seem very focused on your own things. I answered honestly. Yes, I am. I've been prioritizing. Nothing confrontational, nothing revealing, just enough truth to stand on. What they were feeling, but couldn't yet articulate, was loss of control without loss of contact. The most disorienting kind. I was still there. I just wasn't manageable anymore. Moving in silence protected me from being talked out of my choices, from being persuaded back into alignment, from being reminded of costs and sacrifices. Silence created distance without drama, and in that distance, the consequences began to take shape. They just hadn't connected the cause yet. The consequences didn't arrive as conflict. They arrived as an inconvenience. At first, it was small things: delays, gaps, tasks that went unfinished longer than usual, questions that weren't answered quickly enough, plans that didn't come together the way they used to. My parents felt it before they understood it. Systems always do. They began to notice that things took more effort, that coordination required more steps. Those problems lingered instead of resolving themselves quietly in the background. They didn't connect this to my decision. They connected it to the circumstance. Everyone's busy these days. Things are just more complicated now. They said these things aloud, mostly to themselves, but the tone had changed. Where there had once been assumption, there was now uncertainty. Where there had been reliance, there was now friction. They started reaching out more frequently, not with demands, but with expectations. A subtle difference. Messages that assume my involvement without asking for it outright. I responded when appropriate, not automatically. And when I didn't respond, I didn't apologize. That's when the discomfort sharpened. They weren't losing me. They were losing ease. And ease had been the real currency all along. I noticed how quickly that loss produced anxiety. How quickly they tried to restore the old rhythm by referencing the past. We've always done it this way. You've usually handled this. It's just easier when you're involved. Easier. Not fair, not mutual. Just easier. The more they tried to pull me back in, the more apparent the imbalance became. Requests grew less defined, more emotionally framed. The language of obligation resurfaced, softly, tentatively. We don't ask for much. After everything we've done, they trailed off more often now. Because something else had changed. Those phrases no longer landed. I didn't react to them. I didn't reassure. I didn't counter. I simply continued behaving consistently. Consistency is unsettling to people who rely on flexibility they don't acknowledge. As the weeks went on, the consequences compounded. Not dramatically, but cumulatively. Decisions were delayed because no one took ownership. Emotional tensions went unmediated. Logistics required effort instead of assumption. They felt the absence of the role I had played without realizing it had been a role at all. At one point, my mother said, almost wistfully, "You used to be so good at handling things." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was hurt, but because the statement revealed something important. She wasn't asking how I was. She was mourning a function. I answered calmly, "I still am," which was true, just not in the way she meant. The discomfort intensified when they realized the changes weren't temporary, that I wasn't overwhelmed or distracted, that this wasn't a phase. Something fundamental had shifted. They began testing boundaries indirectly. Small requests framed as favors, emotional appeals disguised as casual comments, invitations that assumed compliance. I declined some, accepted others on my terms. No explanation, no pattern they could exploit. Uncertainty replaced predictability. And uncertainty makes people anxious. Not because something bad is happening, but because control is slipping. I could see them trying to diagnose the problem, looking for a cause that didn't implicate the structure of the relationship itself. They never considered that the system had depended on me more than I depended on it. That realization that they needed my role more than they needed me was never spoken aloud, but it shaped everything that followed. The consequences were not punishment. They were exposed. Exposure of how much invisible labor had been holding things together. Exposure of how one-sided the equilibrium had been. And exposure is uncomfortable, especially when no one is shouting, when nothing looks wrong, when the person who changed remains calm, present, and unmoved. That was when they began to sense, not yet fully understand, but sense. Something was no longer negotiable. The moment they realized something was truly wrong didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived with panic. Not loud panic, not dramatic. The kind that leaks out through overcorrection, through sudden concern, through questions that arrive too late and land too shallow. They started checking in more often, but not more deeply. "Are you upset with us? Did we do something? You know we only want what's best for you." The tone had shifted from assumption to uncertainty, from confidence to damage control. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't a rupture they could smooth over with reassurance. It wasn't a misunderstanding waiting for clarification. It was structural. They had mistaken my silence for tolerance for so long that they didn't recognize the difference between disengagement and distress. So when they finally tried to fix it, they reached for the tools they'd always used. Explanations, justifications, minimization. They reframed the spreadsheet as a concern, as transparency, as something they thought I'd appreciate. "We just wanted you to understand how much we've supported you. It wasn't meant to be taken that way. We didn't think it would affect you so deeply." I listened. And in their words, I heard the same pattern repeated. Intent over impact. Structure over emotion, accounting over attunement. They were explaining themselves. They weren't asking me anything. That's how I knew it was too late. Repair requires curiosity. It requires a willingness to see your actions through someone else's lens. What they were offering was reassurance that they hadn't meant harm. That may have been true, but meaning no harm is not the same as taking responsibility. They also tried something else, something more subtle. They became generous. Offers appeared. Help I hadn't requested. Gestures meant to restore balance, as if they sensed a withdrawal and tried to compensate for it with output. But generosity offered without reflection doesn't heal imbalance. It reinforces it, because it still positions them as givers and me as receiver, resetting the same hierarchy the spreadsheet had made explicit. I declined gently. That confused them more than refusal ever could. My mother said, almost pleading, "You don't have to push us away." I looked at her and realized something quietly devastating. They believed closeness depended on my compliance. That without my participation in the old system, the relationship itself was at risk. I didn't correct her. Not because I agreed, but because correcting her would have required reopening something I had already closed. They had begun this process unknowingly. By the time they wanted to undo it, the terms had changed. They also began referencing the past differently. Where before it had been used as leverage, now it was framed as nostalgia. "We used to be so close. You used to tell us everything. Remember how much we used to rely on each other?" Used to. They were grieving the loss of access, not the loss of connection. And that distinction mattered. I remained calm, consistent, present in a limited, deliberate way. I didn't punish them. I didn't withdraw affection. I simply didn't resume the role. That was the part they couldn't fix. You can apologize for words. You can reframe intentions. You can offer gestures. But you can't undo awareness. Once someone sees the structure clearly, returning to unconscious participation is impossible. They sense this. That's where the panic came from. Because panic often follows the realization that the usual tools don't work anymore. They wanted to rewind to before the spreadsheet, before the silence, before the shift. But there is no before once the ledger has been opened. Love can survive many things, but it cannot survive being reduced to a balance sheet without changing form. And they had already changed it. By the time they were ready to listen, I no longer needed to be heard. The dynamic they were trying to save had already ended, not in anger, in clarity. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches. It unfolded the way things do when all the emotion has already been processed elsewhere. We were sitting together, the three of us, in the same room where the spreadsheet had first been handed to me. The setting felt intentional, though no one said that aloud. My father spoke first. He said they felt distance, that they didn't understand where it had come from, that they wanted to clear the air. I listened. When it was my turn, I didn't reference the weeks of silence or the subtle shifts. I didn't list grievances. I didn't explain my internal journey. I addressed one thing only, the framework. I told them calmly that presenting my upbringing as a cost had changed how I understood our relationship, that it reframed care as something measurable and therefore claimable. I didn't accuse them of bad intent. I didn't say they had hurt me. I said it had clarified things. That distinction mattered. I explained that once love is translated into accounting, participation becomes conditional, even if no one says so out loud. That I could no longer engage in a dynamic where my independence needed justification or my gratitude needed performance. I spoke slowly, without emotion, without persuasion. They responded the way I expected. They explained again that they hadn't meant it that way, that it was about transparency, that they were proud of me, that they didn't expect anything in return. I nodded, and then I said the only thing that needed to be said. Intent doesn't change structure. The room went quiet. I continued gently that regardless of what they meant, the effect had been to position them as investors and me as an outcome. I wasn't willing to participate in that framing anymore. I told them what would change, not as a threat, not as a demand, as information. that I would make my decisions independently, that I wouldn't justify them through reference to the past, that I would contribute where I chose, not where it was assumed. I didn't ask for agreement. I didn't need it. My mother asked if this meant I was angry. I said no. She asked if this meant I was pulling away. I said I was redefining proximity. That answer unsettled them more than anger would have, because anger suggests repair. Redefinition suggests permanence. They asked if there was anything they could do to make things go back to normal. I answered honestly, no, not because I wanted distance, but because normal had depended on my silence, and I wasn't going back to that. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There was no apology that changed anything, no agreement that restored ease, but there was clarity. They understood finally that something fundamental had shifted, and that it wasn't negotiable. I left feeling lighter, not victorious, not relieved, aligned. Confrontation doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes it's simply the moment where you stop participating in someone else's interpretation of your life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The structure spoke for itself. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It's a result of what became clear. For a long time, I thought growth would feel like expansion. More confidence, more certainty, more visible strength. Instead, it feels like subtraction. The removal of roles I never agreed to play. The quiet shedding of expectations that were never mine to carry. I didn't become colder after that conversation. I became clearer in my boundaries. I still show up. I still care. But I no longer translate care into compliance. I no longer measure closeness by how much I absorb or how little I ask for in return. The relationship with my parents exists now on new terms. Calmer in some ways, more distant in others, less efficient, but more honest. They no longer assume access to my decisions. They ask, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes tentatively, sometimes not at all, and I answer when I want to. What surprised me most was how much energy returned to me once I stopped overfunctioning. The mental space that opened when I stopped preemptively managing their expectations. The steadiness that came from knowing I wasn't silently negotiating every choice. I didn't replace one identity with another. I didn't reinvent myself. I returned to myself. The version of me that doesn't need to be exceptional to be worthy. That doesn't need to be easy to be loved. That doesn't need to justify her existence through output. I also noticed how this shift affected other areas of my life. At work, I stopped taking on invisible tasks. In friendships, I stopped being the emotional buffer. I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. Not because I enjoyed distance, but because distance can be truthful. People adjusted. Some relationships deepened. Others faded. None of that felt like loss. It felt like alignment asserting itself. What I carry now is not resentment, but discernment. I can love my parents without returning to a system that required my silence. I can appreciate what they gave without allowing it to define what I owe. That distinction took time to integrate, but once it settled, it brought peace. I no longer worry about being misunderstood. I no longer need to be perceived as grateful, understanding, or low maintenance. I am none of those things in a role. I am simply a person who chooses when to give, when to speak, when to stay silent. And that choice is what quiet dominance actually looks like. Not control over others, but authorship over self. I didn't take anything from them. I took myself back. There's a lesson in this story, but it isn't the kind that comes with a slogan or a neat instruction manual. It's quieter than that. Sometimes the deepest rupture in a relationship doesn't come from cruelty or neglect. It comes from a shift in framing, from seeing love as something shared to seeing it as something tallied. When care becomes accounting, the relationship doesn't necessarily end, but it does change its rules. My parents didn't stop loving me, but they stopped relating to me. And when that happened, I had a choice. Keep translating myself into something that fit their ledger, or step out of the accounting altogether. I chose the latter, not because I wanted distance, but because I wanted honesty. The moral here isn't cut people off. It isn't confront everything. And it certainly isn't keep score in return. It's this. When someone defines your worth by what you cost or what you contribute, the most powerful response isn't anger, it's autonomy. You don't need to argue with a system that was built without your consent. You don't need to win a debate about intent. You don't need to prove that your emotional labor has value. You just need to stop participating in a structure that requires you to shrink. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't humiliate or punish. It simply withdraws the energy that made an unfair system feel sustainable. And when that energy is gone, the system reveals itself. What stayed with me most from this experience wasn't the spreadsheet. It was the realization that I had been loved in a way that required my silence, and that I had accepted that because it felt familiar. Walking away from that didn't make me less grateful. It made me more whole. If you're listening to this and something in you feels tight, not angry, not hurt, just alert, I want you to know that clarity doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as permission. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop justifying. Permission to stop being easy so others can stay comfortable. You don't owe anyone access to your life in exchange for what they've already chosen to give. And love that can only exist when you stay small isn't love you're required to preserve. I didn't burn bridges. I stopped carrying them alone. If this story resonated with you, even uncomfortably, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that a relationship in your life was being held together by your silence?